In my last lecture, I talked about different social problems perspectives. As I noted, the dominant perspective is social constructionism, which was established by Malcolm Spector and John Kitsus. The social constructionist perspective basically looks at how groups define social problems and how they identify certain conditions in society as being bad. The textbook that we're reading for this course, Robert Heiner's Social Problems, takes a critical constructionist approach. It's like the social constructionist approach, but a little different. Critical constructionism, just like social construction, looks at how problems get defined in society. But it also recognizes that the elite in society play a really enormous role in how those problems get defined. As well, critical constructionism looks at how our structures of inequality produces some of the most pressing social problems of our day, like poverty. In this lecture, I want to highlight two recent social problems articles to illustrate how scholars look at social problems from a sociological perspective. Both of them use social constructionism, and it'll be a good way to highlight research in this area. Your first reading was by Paula Lantz and Karen Booth, who examined the social construction of the breast cancer epidemic. Like social constructionists, Lantz and Booth don't assume that there's actually an epidemic going on. They just want to see how it's being constructed as an epidemic. As they point out, there was indeed an increase in breast cancer in the 1980s and 1990s. But they cite research that suggests that that increase was mostly due to the fact that more women were getting screened for breast cancer. Because more women were receiving mammograms, more women were getting diagnosed with breast cancer, and as a result, the rates increased. It wasn't actually that more women were getting breast cancer, it was just that more women were getting diagnosed. So why was the media in such a frenzy about the breast cancer epidemic? Lantz and Booth want to find out why, and what they do is they go to popular magazines and they look at how popular magazines covered breast cancer in the 1980s and 1990s. Specifically, they're looking at articles in popular magazines between 1980 and 1995, and they're asking how they covered the breast cancer epidemic. What they found was this. First, most of these articles focused on breast cancer among young women. Now, this is interesting because most of the research, medical research, suggests that breast cancer rates among young women have remained really stable over the past several decades. The increase of breast cancer in the 1980s and 1990s was mostly among women age 40 and older, and that's because those are the women who are getting mammograms. Therefore, those are the women who are increasingly getting diagnosed with breast cancer. Number two, the magazine articles connected breast cancer rates in young women to the behavior of these young women, which they identified as risk factors. Some of the risk factors that they identified included delaying childbearing, using birth control pills, and choosing not to have children. Now, this is also interesting, given that medical research suggests that in 75% of breast cancer cases, there is no identifiable risk factor. Lantz and Booth argue that the magazines are focusing on young women, and they are focusing on the behavior of young women because their coverage of breast cancer reflects social anxiety about women's changing role in society. In your other reading, Eric McWright and Riley Dunlap look at the social construction of global warming as a social problem. But rather than look at how the environmental movement constructs global warming as a problem, they look at how the conservative movement delegitimizes global warming as a social problem. Now, most social problem scholars focus on claims, or ways of portraying certain conditions as bad or undesirable for society. Now, the claim made by the environmental movement is that global warming is occurring and it will have catastrophic effects for life on this planet. The counterclaim made by the conservative movement is that global warming is not occurring and therefore it's not a social problem. McWright and Dunlap understand these counterclaims as attempts to render global warming as not a problem. In other words, they're looking at what they call the non-problematicity. It's a mouthful. To analyze the counterclaims made by the conservative movement, McWright and Dunlap look at documents that were produced and circulated by certain conservative think tanks throughout the 1980s and 1990s. They pick a sample of documents that were produced between 1990 and 1997. And in these documents, they find three counterclaims made by the conservative movement. The first counterclaim is that there's no real evidence, no real scientific evidence for global warming. Here, the conservative movement argued that the condition of global warming doesn't exist. This was the most prevalent counterclaim that McWright and Dunlap found. The second counterclaim was that global warming policies would do more harm than good. This was the second most popular counterclaim that they found. And this was focusing in particular on what the conservative movement thought would be harmful effects if the United States adopted the 1997 Kyoto Protocol limiting greenhouse gas emissions. Specifically, they countered that if the U.S. accepted the Kyoto Protocol or signed the Kyoto Protocol, that this would have harmful effects to the U.S. economy and to U.S. sovereignty. Finally, there was a third counterclaim, and that was that if global warming occurred, it would be beneficial rather than harmful for society. Here, conservatives argued that the condition, if it existed, wasn't problematic. They provided examples like having fewer snow-related car accidents, as well as better tourism with warmer temperatures. This was the third most popular. So, what do we learn about social problems from taking these approaches? And what do we not learn? If you were going to do research on breast cancer or global warming, how would you approach these problems? And how would it be different than Lance and Booth or McWright and Dunlap? More generally, how would it be different from the prevailing approach in social problems research, which again is social constructionism? These are the questions I want you to be asking yourself as we tackle many more social problems throughout this semester. Thanks so much.